It's fantastic. Only a very select few have been invited to this session, so you're very, very lucky, I have to say. This session is being sponsored by the NHBC, who we all know is a very important player in our market and involved in many, many of the schemes that we will all have been involved in. Unfortunately, Tim Reid, who was due to chair it, it has taken ill and hasn't been able to be with us today. So I am Brendan Geraghty from the UKAA. I will act as chair and I will try and keep an NHBC hat on. We're looking at the net zero opportunity and what it might offer us. It's a juicy subject, I think, to say the least, a difficult one. I've got a fantastic panel here. We're going to look at it. We're going to have a short presentation and then discuss various aspects of it and where opportunities might lie. But if we can go around, starting with you, Josephine, just a quick introduction, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Josephine Bentle. I'm a chartered engineer by training. But I am part-time seconded to Aviva Investors, sitting within their ESG team and advising them on how to set their ESG strategy and implement it across their portfolio pipeline.
Sean Granger, I'm from Gallagher Insurance Brokers, and I lead the build-to-rent living proposition for Gallagher. Work with a number of providers to provide insurance programs such as construction and property.
I'm Rory O'Hagan. I'm a director at Assail Architecture. We are residential designers and we've been very closely involved with the growth and evolution of the build-to-rent sector over the last 10 plus years.
Okay, well, Rory's going to give us a bit of a presentation on an approach, or a sensible approach to net zero, and I think that just will set the foundation for our discussions which will follow. So over to you, Rory.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I'll keep this short. This is about scene setting for the discussion, and we'd invite you to get involved, pose lots of questions. Net zero and build to rent. We live in a world of accelerating climate change, and we're seeing those societal impacts. They're tangible and they're growing every year. Our governments have set legal targets to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings comprise globally 39% of emissions. We're doing a reasonable job of tackling operational carbon, so the energy we use to heat and run our buildings. Embodied carbon is a much harder challenge. The build-to-rent business model, that long-term investment play, is strongly aligned with long-term operational efficiency and sustainability, more so than other resi models. We, as a sector, have an opportunity to make long-life, adaptive, ultra-low carbon buildings the standard in our sector. And we know what the near future looks like, 2030. There are lots of organisations such as LETI here in London who are scanning the horizon. And essentially what they're doing is turning the UK's legal commitments into a pathway of performance as we move through time. So in the next few years, essentially from 2025, we need a significant step change in approach in terms of the performance of our buildings. We should be designing to passive house or near passive house levels of performance, which will significantly slash space heating demand. And progress is being made towards that, but we need to move much faster. And intellectually, that's a big challenge for the industry, both in terms of design, the making, the delivery of it, the financing, etc. The harder challenge is reducing embodied carbon, the carbon that goes into the production of buildings. This will become more important as buildings go all electric and the grid decarbonizes. An easy win would be to go all timber or CLT. In a post-Grenfell environment, that's not easy. The insurance market, have certain reservations about getting behind that kind of systems approach. So the risks are evident, present. They're talking about them at COP27 as we meet here today. We're probably on course to exceed the 1.5 degree threshold. The conversation will start to turn towards adaptation as much as mitigation, and the future does look scary in terms of pervasive droughts, leading to food security, breakdown to, which then leads to mass migration and worse. So the biggest risk really is not acting, of being aware of all the facts and not changing our approach. We're beginning to see carbon as become a core metric in terms of building value or building health, and that's only going to increase over time. So fundamentally, this poses the question, in coming years, do we want to create buildings that are just good enough, business as usual, or do we want to get ahead of the curve and go for net zero now or in the near future, knowing that regulation will inevitably catch up towards the end of the decade? And here's the danger that just good enough now will almost certainly not be good enough in the early 2030s. So we run the risk of creating stranded assets if we don't invest in a net zero future in the next few years, frankly. So the opportunity is there to really drive down operating costs, to minimize embodied carbon, to create more resilient buildings, and therefore more valuable assets, because fundamentally we're all about creating and safeguarding value into the future. And then that can be much more attractive to ESG or green capital. The rental or sharing model that underpins our sector points to a circular economy where brands and operators can explore opportunities to open up that sharing, to include furniture, tools, mobility, other goods. Low carbon standards such as passive house. These are as much about resident comfort as they are about sustainability. And I think in a rapidly heating climate, buildings with better air quality, less humidity, better all year round regulated temperatures will become much more attractive. So the opportunity, simply for the sector is to help or lead the decarbonisation of the built environment. So how do we do this? The first step is to build awareness and really, let's get carbon literate as an industry. Let's measure and report carbon on all of our projects, right from the get-go, right through to operations, in the way that square footage or cost rates are core everyday metrics that we use. Let's move beyond a narrow focus on economic viability, think in triple bottom line terms, measure impacts on society, on people, in addition to the environment. MMC has a part to play. Precision manufacturing, this will reduce construction waste, increase buildings' operational performance. But let's go beyond that, rethink our design approach in a way that points to a regenerative future, where we create buildings and components that can essentially be reused and reconfigured, and harness the opportunity to use remanufactured or reused materials. Designing in a capacity for adaptation will help drive the longevity of our buildings well beyond the industry standard of 50, 60 years. And we used to build like this, so it feels like we need to go back to that again. We need to think 100 years plus in terms of building life. Digitizing building fabric and operations on every project will allow the sector to really understand performance versus design intentions, and to during operations to make those adjustments and those improvements to drive efficiency. And again, that kind of underpins asset value. So in a way, this sector didn't really exist 10 years ago, and we came together as an industry around a shared vision and a shared strategy. We similarly need to break out of our silos again and work towards bringing net zero as the sector standard, because ultimately, this is the best way to safeguard the vigorous growth of the sector, but also value well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. I think we can see there's rather a lot to try and take on there. And I think if I just make a comment from a sort of an HBC perspective, originally this panel, and I did make an error at the beginning to say we were supposed to have been joined by Puran Desai of One Planet Living, oneplanet.com, who of course did BedZ and has been in this game for a very long time. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to make it. There's some transport issues that he couldn't get over. So we'll progress without that. But I just want to make the point that the NHBC has always been in the collaborative space in this industry, working with designers, clients, developers and contractors to get the product right, to get it certified and effectively underwritten so it can go forward into the market. And then the likes of Sean, who then come at an insurance point slightly further down the line, can be satisfied. So it's always been interesting to me that from a design perspective, and I am an architect, so I always look at it, that being the most important bit. Suddenly there's a whole lot of other hurdles that we have to get over within this process. So if we take it back to one of the options or one of the tools to bring down carbon, which is MMC, which I think we can start to say is beginning to gather pace. We now have two of the tallest volumetric buildings in Europe down in Croydon using the TIDE system. And we're seeing other methods coming through here. But Josephine, I want to take this to you now. You're working with Aviva, huge investor. They also do insurance. How are they looking at this issue? You're embedded with their team. You're going to be helping them, I guess, on strategy and deliverability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How are they approaching it? You know, what are they looking for? What will they do? What will they not do?
Well, I think they see MMC as a real area for opportunity. They recognise that there's a big impact on programme, which is obviously very positive. It could have a really big impact on embodied carbon if it's done right. It does reduce waste significantly if it's done right again. So I think there's a whole myriad of different opportunities that I think we definitely want to capture. I saw something really exciting the other day when I went around build-to-rent scheme for sort of homes, where they were doing 3D printing to create cladding panels, which was using the dust created from cutting brickwork to then create cladding panels. So it's using waste materials to create really thermally well-performing cladding materials. It's sort of this, and it was being able to put up really quickly. So you can see all these like complementing positive benefits. The only thing I would counter it a little bit, I think MMC people think, particularly in modular housing, modular construction, people see that as a big win. You do have to check you're doing it right, because some cases you might start to double up thicknesses of walls or floors and ceilings, and you can, without realising, have a really negative impact on your embodied carbon. So you've got to double check that you're not over-engineering it, but I would say on the whole it's a really big positive.
I mean, the embodied carbon piece is huge, and MMC in its various guises, I mean, that doubling up is a common issue. But if I just stay with Aviva for a moment and green investments and that, are we seeing a demand from money, from investors that says, you know, we need to get better, we need to do better, we want more? Is that evident in your work with Aviva?
Definitely, they've got whole funds nowadays which have sort of a climate focus, climate transition fund. There are various other ones where the whole focus for that fund is for any asset sitting within that is either, you know, on the pathway to net zero carbon, or is seen as an asset which we can take from being a brown asset to a green asset. So is, you know, helping the bigger picture. So there's definitely an increasing demand. Financial regulations are also changing quite quickly. Article 9 funds, the EU taxonomy, it's all demanding more and more from the assets that we're creating and looking after. And so it's just an ever-expanding topic that's actually quite hard to keep on top of all the time.
I mean, it sounds like in the financial markets there's some great innovation and some great demand being, demand being made. The recycling of brick dust, I think, is. I haven't heard that. That's simply, that's, I think, creativity at work in the workplace. I then come back and I come out and I go, oh, what would the NHBC say about that? How would we integrate that and still meet the general compliance that they would expect of us? And then, Sean, I come to you and say, I've got this building. We went through the processes. We used brick dust. Are you happy to insure it?
I think it's difficult. Is the insurance industry as a whole, whether it's Aviva, Zurich, the main people out there are striving to be supportive of sustainability in the materials used. Looking at CLT or any MMC or modular building through the construction phase, it's very easy to obtain insurance for it. NHBC can put the warranties in place as well as other commercial providers will do that. But there's a kind of, we spoke about it before in one of the other sessions in investment, there's a work scope gap between what was designed, what the contractors have built, and then what's handed over to the operators. Now, if you have a funder, owner, operator, and they've got the whole scale of it through, the insurance is never an issue. And we're really keen on things like recycled brick dust or CLT or anything else that goes with it, because there's a story to tell and there's a reason why. But there's still problems in the isolation of looking at these buildings. If someone turns up, if you turn up at 10 to 5 on a Friday and say, I've got this building, it's going to be hard, compared to you saying, I've got one that's been in operation for 15 years, can you go and insure it? Because it moves very much from the vanilla to the quite niche and complicated.
And we can see that, and I think, I mean, whilst we're sort of talking about build to rent, it's a general, this is a general, it applies to the industry more generally, but I guess in build to rent, with the institutional money coming into the sector, they're putting different demands on the process, and it's a long-term hold, so there's slightly different dynamics. Rory, are you seeing a net zero brief come through to you?
Not explicitly. We're seeing, we're finding it much easier to have that conversation from day one, frankly. And, as a company, we're assuming the mantle to be very strong advocates now for what 2030 looks like, and really banging the drum for that, and making it almost a kind of imperative of the sector to get on board with it. Those figures I showed you, those are all underpinned by legal targets. So legislation might lag by a couple of years, but fundamentally the change is coming at us really quickly, and it is going to be really significant. So we've done pieces of work with large landowners, master planners, local authorities, that very much try to draw out those design tactics, what 2030 looks like. And I suppose the big lesson is, if you're designing for net zero, that imposes certain disciplines around building form, factor, orientation, which may be in tension with townscape, context, the rest of it. So, the whole conversation is going to change massively in the next 6-7 years.
I think the selection, particularly of superstructure, and how that impacts on the building form is a really interesting area. I just would like to take it back to Sean's point, which is this sort of siloed structure we have, that there is sometimes a gap in specification transfer from inception through to development and ultimately into operation, and how we deal with that. So NHBC would typically, if it was an MMC product, would simply typically can give a warranty of up to 60 years. So a question asked in a previous session is that, given build to rent institutional support, could we expect a longer duration? Will they expect a longer duration than 60 years? Because that does talk to net zero in terms of both in use and embodied carbon. Are you seeing that at all in the conversations within the financial markets?
In terms of longer design life?
Longer design life as a tool within the entire process.
Not enough. No, to be honest. I mean, I think there's a real sense of, there's an urgency to get more housing out there, and so there's more, new housing, which is fine, but there's a huge amount of existing building stock which we should be making, much more of, and I think there needs to be more of a conversation around that design life, to try and save that a bit.
Sure, from your side, design life.
I think it's massively important. For us, we kind of look at the view of, if someone is spending that money and investing in the quality of the build, because it is built to rent and it has to last, and the yield has got to be sort of 40, 50 years anyway, the quality of the build is going to be better. So therefore, the death knell of many insurers is escape of water. So if you've got buildings that aren't built right and are leaky, that is where the claims are going to come, and that's where the costs are going to rise. But with build to rent, there's going to be little things rather than the big, we'll talk about the bigger things anyway, but the little things like tiling under bath panels and tiling under kitchens to stop, the water leaks. So then if the people are doing that, then the operators are going to be concerned about the maintenance and the security of the buildings, and therefore it's an easier conversation to have from an insurance perspective.
So, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to add to that because there's the design life of a structure, which is 60 years supposedly. The MEP is shorter than that. And I think what is being talked about a lot more is that this recognition of stranding assets, and we don't want to be producing assets that within a very short period of time, given the heat waves that we're having and the flooding that we're having, we're going to have to go back in and spend huge amounts of money redesigning these and refitting them with different systems to make them perform better. And it's speaking back to a point, Rory, about designing things that are going to be resilient for the climate that is ultimately already changed and will continue to change even if we were to stop emitting carbon tomorrow.
It's the spend now to save later, but not just
Yeah.
from a cost point of view or a life cycle point of view. That actually, will the building still function in a changing climate? And if you've got to forward plan that and model it, I think that's vitally important.
And that is being talked about in the investors quite a lot.
Can we just say that I think this point is really important because it talks to, the resilience talks about effectively de-risking, which we will all be, be concerned about. There's lots of ways we can approach that. I mean, we can look at BIM modeling and digital twins, and you can run simulations and all that kind of thing. We can, the quality of construction and the install, the basics, get the basics right, is another area where I think there can be vast improvements. I mean, how do we, it's a tough area to get right. So how do we, what are the first, what does resilient design actually mean? How do I do it?
I think we can look back to the 60s. There was a movement in Holland called the Open Building Movement that were very much ahead of their time. And in simple terms, it was about thinking of a building in very discrete layers, to think about superstructure as almost infrastructure, roads. A local authority could even build that. And that would include that kind of, the distributed MEP that's tapped off in each unit. And then to give over ownership to, a different tier of stakeholder, be that residents or a build-to-rent operator, to then do the infill. And the infill, not necessarily sacrificial, but could be demounted and moved on. So it's this whole idea of perhaps taking elements of buildings and moving it into a kind of infrastructure categorization. And that's been run for years, frankly. And some of those buildings are now enjoying second lives as cultural buildings, as offices. So there's a lot of merit in designing for adaptation, because it drives longevity, which takes landfill out of the option. It drives, or rather gives options at the end of the kind of residential scenario for other use cases. It makes a lot of sense, and fundamentally we've been doing it for centuries. If you look at some of the great warehouses in London, the East India Company have got a warehouse a stone's throw from here. It's been going around for 400 plus years. It's been used for storage. It's been used for events like this. Is now posh apartments, and there are certain characteristics there that we can learn from in terms of big spans, super robust materials, uniform windows, real durability and longevity. This has been done before. We're not reinventing the wheel.
I'd also add again that things like Passive House have a climate resilience nature built into that design standard. It takes into account likely overheating, getting the solar gains right from the start, and balancing all those sort of internal changes so that in future climates it would be looking better. And I do think it is the way that the industry is going, is towards Passive House. So that should hopefully help.
The Passive House standard, or getting close to it, we can see the merits of that. It does feel a little bit like we're in a prototyping space where we want to figure out how to do these buildings, and we want to figure out how to do them efficiently and cost effectively. From the earlier panel today, IKEA have demonstrated that you can be very, very green and consider everything about the process and still deliver affordable product. That's taken them some time. They didn't wake up and do it in the timescales that we've got to do this. So we're in a transitioning period. I don't know how long that transition is going to last before we are very confident about how to go about this. But I suppose it still comes back to the question around, follow the money, and whether what do we need to, what are the barriers to this? There'll be barriers at every level, but if we talk about the barriers at an institutional level, at a funding level, and there'll be other barriers beneath that. But if I can ask you, Josephine, to just, what do you think the barriers are?
There are a few. We've got standards that we've set for build-to-rent housing for Aviva investors, and I think some of the challenges that what we're asking for is not commonly done. So we're wanting to understand the operational performance of a new home in its design, and all we get is EPC certificates. And we all know how that doesn't really paint us the proper picture. And measuring embodied carbon is not considered necessarily business as usual or normal yet. And so I feel like I'm often asking for things that are unusual of house builders and that sort of thing. So it's a big learning curve, I think, for everyone within the industry. And I think we've all got to start learning now, because it's going to require investment to go through that learning process. But we need to be building to net zero carbon standard. The new build homes need to be meeting net zero carbon by 2025 or 2030 if we're going to be on track. So we sort of need to get that learning under our belt now, quickly, so that come then we can actually meet our net zero carbon commitments. So it's a lot of learning, I would say. It's just gearing the whole industry up.
And literacy and education, I think, is a big part of this. I mean, do you think, Sean, from your perspective, I mean, and this is a slightly tricky, not tricky, but I don't mean this to be a negative question, because I do know that Gallagher and you yourself are very proactive in trying to understand it's a big industry, there's a lot happening. I mean, from your side, what do you think the barriers are? How do you see the industry? You're having to look at it from a very risk influence perspective.
Yeah, I think we're a data-driven industry, as most of BTR is as well. So we can't look back to previous buildings that have been built in this way to know how they'll perform, and we can only guess going forward as to what it will be. Insurance doesn't want to be a barrier to any kind of net zero or sustainable buildings. Most of the major insurers are, as I say, are keen on pushing it. But I think there needs to be more talk in the industry. We do a lot with the Structural Timber Association, working with those type of bodies to get that data, I think, is key for us.
I think the data point is I think, key for the entire industry. So there are challenges out there, but the momentum is building. It sounds to me like momentum is building, and we will see, I think, both the expectation and the ability to produce these. Net zero. I haven't even gone to net zero carbon, because I think it's so complicated that all the governance around that is really important. But we must go there. But before doing that, build to rent, if we take it back to this as generally being, urban build to rent are apartments, and we now have the rise of suburban build to rent, which is generally houses. Both good candidates for MMC, both good candidates for pioneering this approach. And the reason I say pioneering is built to rent, because it's a long-term hold. We have the influence and the management opportunity to describe the way that we want our buildings to perform and allow that to influence the development brief. How do you, is there a difference between these two types of built to rent? Is it the principles are the same, but do we have to apply it differently? Is there anything, Rory, how are you looking at that?
I guess the opportunity with single-family housing, which is typically going to be 2 or maybe 3-story, a whole volumetric boxes of floor. You've got, from day one, you've got amazing airtightness. You've got that precision engineered proposition. And what's even better than the urban product, you could probably do this in timber frame volumetric, which flies under the radar in terms of the insurance risk. And really gets that embodied carbon down. In fact, sequesters carbon. So in a way, that urban or suburban model is going to get us closer to net zero quicker. One would have thought. Doesn't have the same kind of risk profile. That said, there are innovations in everyday materials like cement that be it low carbon cement. Admixture or indeed recycled cement that will get that kind of RC frame mid-rise urban superstructure down where we need it to go.
Okay, so I think, you know, I don't, whatever the scale of the building, the issues remain the same. So perhaps this is the segue into embodied carbon. I mean, zero carbon in use, I think we kind of know how to do that. There's a resilience factor, the M&E particularly, embodied carbon. How, you know, if we look at the REBA 2030 guide and LET and other things, we are going to have to start really documenting this and being very careful and thoughtful about what we specify and justifying it. There's very few buildings that I'm aware of that are doing this in an in-depth way. I mean, perhaps we also need to recognize where we are. We're coming to terms with the scale of this challenge as quickly as we can, but we still have to take fairly modest steps in the journey, and we're very much in the modest. I think we've gone past baby steps, but our steps haven't got that much wider or longer. How do, again, I'm always interested in how the money looks at this. So what is money's view on embodied carbon? What will they want from the industry? If I turn to an investment pack and they're looking to invest in a scheme or buy a scheme, what will they want to see in that pack with regards to carbon?
So Aviva's net zero carbon commitment is for scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So it includes embodied carbon. So they really recognise that in order to meet that commitment, embodied carbon will become an increasingly integral part of, you know, finding the solution. So there's an increasing demand, and it recognises that until we come to a true circular economy, which is probably still a little way off, we're ultimately going to have to be paying the offsets for all the embodied carbon. And carbon offsets at the moment may not be very expensive in the grand scheme of things, right or wrongly, more likely. But they're going to probably get bigger, and that is a financial consideration.
So the embodied carbon piece really seems to present a bigger risk for the investors. I mean, there's the delivery risk, as it were, and then there's the potential punitive action as a result of regulation, or just the offsets are so expensive or become so expensive that it threatens viability generally.
Exactly, because there's only going to be so many offsets out there ultimately, and everyone has well, not everyone, lots of people have net zero carbon commitments, and a lot of people are going to be heavily reliant on offsetting, and so that price is going to go up.
Rory, to you, I mean, you won't have heard that the construction price has gone up. As an architect, how do we balance this? How do we draw the right line between the carbon, a design that's going to reduce carbon in the round, but then also recognizing that its deliverability may be compromised by some of the ability to offset or deal with those sort of wider issues, which aren't necessarily design issues?
Yeah, it's tricky. I guess we did an exercise with a big landowner a year or two ago about meeting their 2030 agenda and leaving aside materials. You know, there's certain aspects of you know, a building that frankly have to be jettisoned if we want to get to where we need to in terms of embodied carbon. So basements, that's huge. It's usually 20 to 30% of the embodied carbon on a typical urban apartment building. So imagine the future without basements. You bring everything up to the ground floor, you start to have difficult conversations around activation of facades, etc. So you're going to see a lot of you know, force to kind of you know, move away from these deep dig-outs, piles as well, trying to turn those into kind of prefabricated solution. Again, that's completely dependent on growing conditions. There is one big opportunity area. Facade systems are a big component of embodied carbon, and there's a huge opportunity to essentially reuse and remanufacture, particularly metal cladding systems. There is a lot of recycling going on in you know, in kind of claddings as it stands within the supply chain. But there's an opportunity to go much, much further, and that can eat into about 15% of the embodied carbon. MEPs like 20%, 25%, and there needs to be a lot of kind of technical innovation, which is way beyond my level of expertise.
No, thank you. I mean, it's a tough question. Sean, hopefully not such a tough question to you. Do you see a time when the lack of appropriate carbon mitigation becomes an insurance risk?
It has been posed before as could it be an insurable risk, but I don't know what the trigger would be, whether they would say it was too expensive or whatever they go for it. I think the attitude towards insurers I think it will move away to them saying we would only put our capacity to insure against buildings that met those regulations, because their overall presentation themselves is, as Josephine said from Aviva, is to hit these targets by a certain point. So that is going to dictate what goes forward, really, certainly in my space.
But there are some homes already becoming uninsurable because of climate change. So,
I mean, interesting. So we try and solve the problem, and we may not get insurance, and then we have buildings which won't get insurance because they never try to solve the problem. An interesting conundrum. We have a few minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions from the floor. If anybody would like to throw a question at us that we could discuss before we start to wrap up. Okay.
I do, but I don't think it's really. It was just around. Just around how the appearance of buildings. I mean, just what you said about cladding, and if you leave a building ugly, then do you automatically reduce the embedded carbon in the building? So, forget your cladding, forget making it pretty.
Yeah.
And there's a point where people just accept ugly for the sake of, meeting that, reducing global temperatures and flooding.
Yeah, I think what looks good is going to change a lot, and I don't know what your definition of ugly is, but I think the most valuable buildings in the future won't be the shiniest. They'll be the adaptive and the ones that consciously use existing materials and not really changing that much to kind of integrate into the wider design proposition. Just my thought.
There's a big question here around the urban design and the planners and their understanding of what I think this really means for townscapes and that sort of thing, and what it might mean if we don't have a basement and we don't have cars, then that suggests one thing. But it talks to a point I think that's been made a number of times at the conference, which is we have to look at this in the round. There's no silver bullets. There's no one single approach that's going to solve everything. It's more like a shotgun cartridge with multiple tiny pellets in it, which are silver, because we have to get them all.
Has anybody on the panel projected how long, on average, you think, given the rate of reduction, you can repay that 39% of carbon that's built into the building? Do we know how long?
39% of carbon.
Yeah, so buildings, as you say, it's 39%.
That was just the general point of buildings in use and in the making of them are 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's the making of them is 39%, is that correct?
Well, the making and the operating of them.
Okay.
But the operating will get much more efficient and have a smaller footprint over time. And it's the embodied carbon is the big challenge over the next couple of decades.
Right. Well, I think it's been a difficult conversation. Let's face it. I think there's no easy answers, but I think the panel has not shied away from trying to deal with it and offer some ways through. I think what I'm taking from this is that there's a long way to go. There's not a lot of time to go that long way, but it's clear that there's a joined up approach. I think that's what's most encouraging. We have the money saying they want to do it and are willing to be flexible and creative. We have the insurance market saying we're not going to be sticklers in the mud here. We want this to work as well. And of course we have the designers going, well, look, we can put this together and we can try, and then and there's a huge passion and desire to get that right. So, it feels like we have the right heart and the right sort of brains in the room to solve this, but we do, I think, have a long way to go to make it deliverable at scale and deliverable with some of the viability questions or expectations that are out there in the industry. So a balancing act for sure. But I think with the help of my panel and the NHBC, we will make progress. So thank you very much, everybody.